Silent Hill 1. If I ask you to say the first word that pops into your mind when seeing this game, probably most of you would say things like classic or retro, or maybe old if you've never seen this game before, or you're really an asshole. Yet, after beating the 4 original games, the ones made by Team Silent, I think the word experimental suits more what I think of this game. And I say this because I kind of feel that this game is the result of 3 different visions that in many times conflict between one another about what this new horror game, and by extent the rest of the franchise, must be. This diversity in ideas condensed into one product will be responsible of both the game's virtues as well as its flaws. But in what consist these 3 artistic visions, and who defend them? Let's start by addressing the most obvious actor here, Konami. By the end of the 19s, the trending of survival horror games was in all-time high, and all thanks to none other than Resident Evil. Since 1996, Capcom was making tons of money with this franchise. In fact, the last entry of the series by the time Silent Hill 1 was out is Resident Evil 2, which sold more than 6 million copies, a lot for the time. Konami wanted a piece of the pie, and so made plans to have its own Resident Evil. And being the awful crash grabbers that they are, they just wanted a mere clone to attract as many potential customers as possible. Yet, we should keep in mind that we're not talking about the current Konami. You know, the one that can no longer make a decent football game and just cares about pachinko?
Look how they massacred my boy.
This is the 90s Konami, one of the most trusted gaming companies. Each game they released, if not a success, was, at the very least, a decent one. A solid one. Huh? Get it? Because Metal Gear is from Konami? In other words, the gamers of the time trusted Konami because it was a seal of quality. And that isn't just because they throw a lot of money into their games, which they did, but because they tried to hire the best young minds that Japan had to offer, both in terms of programming and game design. Konami opened the door for people whose talent had yet to show off in something relevant. Guys like Masahiro Ito, Hiroyuki Owaku, and Takayoshi Sato, all of whom were fundamental in this game as well as the next ones, had their first chance here. Yet, they would not work alone, but alongside veterans like Akira Yamaoka or Keiichiro Toyama, the director himself. It seems like the key for success here was balance.
As all things should be.
But perhaps the decisive factor was the artistic freedom that this group enjoyed. You see, Team Silent, as this group will later be known in the West, saw how Konami became less and less interested in the project as time goes on, probably due to the success of other franchises like Winning Eleven or Metal Gear. Add the fact that games at that time took less money to make and so had less pressure from the investors, and you end up with a team that was mostly free to pursue whatever they think was best for the game. I think this freedom was fundamental in providing an opportunity for the second artistic vision of the game, the religious cult stuff. Yeah, I'm not very good at naming things. These ideas were the ones that started separating Silent Hill from its influences with Resident Evil and other games of the genre, thus shaping its own identity, bringing a much more serious story than what we were used to at the time. One that involves a dark and corrupt conspiracy alongside disturbing elements such as black magic and occultism. A horror story like never before that as such needed a more sinister and obscure ambience, one that truly reflects how a terrible power is slowly eating and transforming our reality into a twisted, horrible version of it. If I had to say who is mostly responsible for these ideas, my bet will go to director Toyama. Why? Well, once Silent Hill 1 was released, he left the team to join Sony, from which he created another horror franchise, the Siren games. And you wouldn't guess, the plots of all those games revolves around a cursed town, a religious cult, and ancient deities. Yeah, the guy was really into it. Thus, the idea of combining the core mechanics of Resident Evil with a much more heavy and dark atmosphere and story began to take shape. It was promising, and so Konami gave permission to continue. But before you start idealizing them with the idea that the old Konami was better and what happened that made them so different, I want to share with you a little story. The story of Takayoshi Sato, a man who has spent 2.5 years sleeping in his office desk so he could create CGI scenes all by himself. During development, he insisted on the necessity of renderized cutscenes, an element which can all agree is emblematic of this game, and offered himself to complete such a task. Yet, despite all the team agreeing with this, Konami stated that such a thing could only be made outside of his work time and with no extra pay, and even threatened him to not putting his name on the credits. Konami was always evil. They were just smarter back then. Nonetheless, this story shows us the influence that the team leaders of the different areas of development had on decision making. Unlike Metal Gear under Kojima or the Quantic Dream games under David Cage, the Silent Hill franchise would never had a single brilliant mind that takes all the credit, but rather a whole team of different important people. That's why we know the first 4 games as the ones of Team Silent, in which every leader of every section is as important as the current director. In my opinion, it is them who were behind the third artistic vision of this game, one that they will follow almost exclusively in the next one once director Toyama left the team. Which vision I'm talking about? Well, Silent Hill 1 isn't widely known as the game of religious cults, but rather as one of the biggest exponents of psychological horror in gaming, right? And that renown began in the very first entry, but not just because they used it to justify the events of the game as many did before. No, Team Silent made a step forward. The psychological elements will no longer be attached solely to the script. Instead, it will become a core part of our experience, influencing not just the story, but the design of the monsters that will haunt us in our journey, as well as the scenery that surround us at all time. It would become something present throughout the entire journey, becoming not just a mere reason onto why being afraid story-wise, but instead what actually scares us while playing. Alright, so we have a bunch of ideas about cults and dark magic combined with psychological horror that explores what is hidden behind a traumatized mind, as well as elements of a famous horror franchise that couldn't be more thematically separated from this type of horror. It's a promising mix, with potential, yes, but let's be honest, there are many things that could go wrong here. Yet, Silent Hill succeeded in solving almost all these problems, coming out as one of the best games of PlayStation 1. How did they do it? Okay, let's start by the basic. As I stated before, Silent Hill 1 is inspired by the first Resident Evil games, right? We can see this influence primarily in the gameplay. The way you move, attack, use your inventory, and more is practically a copy of the first entry of the Capcom's franchise, and thus joining the trend of tank mechanics used at the time in basically every horror game out there. We are talking about an uncomfortable system, a rough one that does not allow us to move freely, but the exact opposite. The combat is hard, and the camera angle puts us on our nerve by always letting a side of us exposed. It's far away of any sensation of power and control, almost overhuman, that every action game offers us. Here we are reduced to a normal person in a situation that clearly overwhelms him. In other words, we are defenseless, unprotected for what lies ahead. And so, many of you will now say that, with some changes or not, the way that these two games give fear to the player is the same. At the end of the day, the formula of one or the other is basically the same, right? And you couldn't be more wrong. Do you really think that tank controls are the main factor onto why these games are spooky? Wait. Don't close the video yet. Let me explain myself. I know that the subject I'm touching is for many the holy grail of horror gaming, especially those who think that all new horror games are trash and that they made better horror games before. I'm gonna start by saying that I'm not denying what I just said. On the contrary, I do believe that the tank controls are excellent at evoking a general feeling of helplessness to the player. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that those type of controls are what actually scares us. Rather than that, I think that they are a great way to create tension. The player is tense, and although that's a key element of fear, it isn't what terrifies us per se. It's more like a fertile land from where fear can then grow and become effective. So, how did these games frighten us back then? Let's start by taking a look to the first Resident Evil. Here I would say that there are 5 main factors. 1. A constant lack of resources necessary to survive. 2. A claustrophobic ambience. 3. Monsters which are very hard to kill in a definitive way. 4. Limited save points. And 5. A map filled with puzzles that constantly forces you to turn around and revisit areas you probably entered before. Combine all this and you drive the player to a state where he can never be sure about what he's doing, always feeling unease regarding his current resources and constantly wondering if he's really making progress or did he fucked up at some point and will have to load a much more older save file. The thing is that since ammunition is scarce and zombies are hard as fuck to kill, we can barely clean a few areas, many of which we will have to return at some point. And to make things worse, we cannot save whenever we like, since we have to always pay attention to how much ink ribbons we have left. We are forced to take decisions all the time regarding which path is more convenient to follow. If we should take down those zombies and waste precious bullets, or take the risk knowing that we might need to use a heal item. Or if we should save now or keep the ribbon, knowing that you can waste hours of gameplay. The danger of losing is big, and if you fucked up, it's all your fault because you take the wrong decisions. For me, that constant uncertainty is what frightens the player. The risk of ruining hours of my life if I just make the wrong move or take the wrong path made me feel a constant dreadful sensation while playing the game. A sensation I could only describe as fear. But Silent Hill couldn't be more far away from all this. Sure, the saving is restricted to certain areas, but they're kind of close one to the other, and once there we can save how many times we want. It's extremely rare that we ran out of ammunition or healing items, and enemies are easy to kill in a definitive way. Just a kick in the balls, nice and simple. There are not that many puzzles, and the ones we find don't tend to require the player to go back and forth between the areas of the map. And, although some of them are pretty claustrophobic, half of these areas give us long corridors where we can have plenty of chances to dodge the monsters. So, where is the fear coming from then? The answer is in its ambience, showing the darkness of the human mind and the power of an evil cult demands a much more sinister ambience, one much more frightening and dark than the more close to reality places of Resident Evil. This was accomplished thanks to the sound, the lighting, music, and loads of visual elements that conveys such high level of tension and disgust that we players just want to get the heck out of there as soon as possible. It's so horrible what we see and hear that we want to escape there almost by instinct. We don't want to be there any second longer. All the time it feels like something terrible is about to happen. The pressure is so overwhelming to the point that we can only feel fear and even panic. Yet, combining this hard and frustrating gameplay with this frightening ambience that, as we said, was needed to bring a much more serious story, might be too much for the player. The developers realized that most people will feel overwhelmed by this and most likely quit the game since the pressure will be too high for them. So, in order to prevent this, they found a new equilibrium in which they remove everything that might make us feel uncertain or insecure about our strategy, our resources, how much we did advance, etc. Leaving mainly the tank controls and the spooky ambience as the new balance, as all things should be. This is how Silent Hill effectively created its own formula on how to inject terror in the player, one that will give them success not just in this entry, but also in the games to come. Before continuing, I would like to talk more deeply about how Silent Hill created this dreadful ambience that we mentioned earlier, and what a better starting point than the element which, although many times ignored, is fundamental to the whole experience: the music. Composed by Akira Yamaoka, in general terms, the soundtrack of this game follows a style marked by dichotomy. On one side, we have the songs that are excellent at conveying to the player a feeling of an uncomfortable quietness, where you know you're safe now, but not for a second do you forget the weird mess that you're into. In each track, the melody is always clear and calm. The frequency is constantly slow, and we can see how there is no big jumps between the cycles. Generally, there's only one instrument playing, but if there's more, then they complement harmoniously with one another, always leaving one of them to take the main role in the track. Yet, the way that these songs spread this oddness varies from track to track. In the case of the song we're listening, Clawfinger, this is done in the choice of the instrument. You hear that, right? It sounds familiar, but at the same time, it's like something we never heard before. There are bells, alright, but it gives you the sense like they had been affected by the madness of the town. And so, now it sounds like a piano? If you wonder how they made that, well, that's the magic of the electronic keyboard for ya. But then we have a song like Cafe Rest Theme, where the weirdness doesn't come from the main instrument, but from what accompanies it. It's something that goes in tune with the rest of the song, and so does not break the quietness of it, but it still sounds weird and outlandish. Side note, I like that the guitar part is clearly inspired by Twin Peaks. And you know, it's a good show. You should watch it. Now, let's compare this with the other side of the soundtrack, the songs that should give us fear while both exploring and engaging in combat. And we can see, or rather hear, that this is the opposite of the other, more calm music. I mean, just listen to whatever this is. Not only has any kind of quietness been blown out of the window with these very strong sounds, the fast frequency and the constant jump of cycles that don't follow any sort of cohesion, but now I'm not sure if there's even a melody here. Now we have tons of instruments playing one above the other, like if they were fighting to get all the attention. More than music, it seems we're hearing noises, horrible and twisted noises. Yamaoka did this by simply recording hits and other booming sounds, then creating a loop version of it and then mixing it all with other noises. But that's not all. He also used everyday sounds that we tend to associate with unpleasant situations. For example, in the song My Heaven, you can hear this awful, squealing noise while fighting the final boss. And guess what? It is in fact a distorted dentist drill. Truly the most traumatic thing in our current time. This little thing subtly reinforced the psychological and oniric aspect of this game, showing us how the traumatizing elements of the day-by-day of a person stays hidden somewhere in the deepest part of our psyche. And this helps us understand that what we are facing comes from someone's nightmares and fears. It's a little detail, but I like it. But wait, there's even more. Take a look at this clip. Do you hear how the generator sounds strangely off? This sound becomes later part of the For All song, and I think it's a brilliant move from Yamaoka to organically show how every part of the world is slowly deforming thanks to the ever-increasing power of the religion and its god. Truly a masterpiece. But I'll be honest, and I say that sometimes I'm too baby for this shit, and I feel that this is too much for me to handle. Nonetheless, we shouldn't forget how the scenery also plays a role as vital as the music in terms of displaying these themes of cults and psychology in an organic manner, not just by showing us creepy and symbolic designs, which they do flawlessly, but also in the way that they present us the town and how we can explore it. A way that, should I add, was groundbreaking for the games at the time. To understand this, we have to talk about the fog. I'm sure that you already know that the famous mist was created in order to get the PS1 to renderize the enormous maps of the game without the console catching fire. Now, what I think most people don't realize is how revolutionary this technique was. Because this meant that the game was not restricted to presenting the story only in closed spaces. On contrast, the first Resident Evil games had to do this and were therefore obliged to always lock the player in one big place for most of the time. Places like the Spencer Mansion or the police station, And so they had to rely on dozens upon dozens of weird and unreal puzzles from which to justify why the player couldn't escape those areas quickly and had instead to backtrack and keep exploring the interior of that building for the majority of the game. But thanks to the fog, Silent Hill wasn't limited by this issue and could instead focus on creating a town as real and normal as any other in the Western Hemisphere. Neighborhoods with both long avenues and cramped alleys, hospitals and schools with its big corridors and small rooms, all of which seems familiar in many ways. This may seem to be a small detail, but it actually opened up a whole world of possibilities for the developers regarding what they could do in the game. Things like improving the pacing by creating transitions between wide open areas and confined spaces, ensuring that once the player has spent enough time in small claustrophobic areas and thus become accustomed to it, boom, he's sent back to open spaces, and when he feels comfortable again, bam, back in the narrow rooms and hallways. A nice back and forth to keep the game constantly tense. Another thing that was now possible was to create hidden places in a more organic way, meaning that now, in order to enter some secret room, you didn't need to do some wild shit, you just have to explore. Deciding to go to this part of the town although you didn't have to, or to check if a building is close or not even though it doesn't lead you to your objective. Hey look, I can enter into the police station, now I will be able to read some crucial information and so learn what the fuck is going on in this town. Hey look, the motel is open, now I can get an item which will then be used to transform a Virgin Mary looking woman into a eldritch horrifying monster. Isn't it cool? But maybe the most important thing that this open scenario achieves is the sense of a twisted everyday life. That every part of the town in the fog still resembles a normal place that could exist in the real world, despite all the weirdness that surrounds it. Take the Spencer Mansion from Resident Evil 1. There you always have the impression that no matter what, there is no way that someone actually lived in that crazy house filled with traps and weird puzzles. The developers of that game took advantage of that game logic to reinforce the script, since later you found out that the Spencer Mansion was in fact built by Umbrella not for anyone to live in, but to test their new biological weapons. Team Silent would also take the scenery as a way to enhance the plot, but in a total different approach, one heavily geared towards realism. They wanted you to feel that every house, every street, every school, and so on was not just real, but also familiar. That the player would feel connected to these places because they remind him of somewhere he had been. The fact that Team Silent took the movie Kindergarten Cop to make sure that Midwich School looks as close as your typical American school speaks volumes about it. The main advantage of this strategy is that, as a general rule, horror is more effective when it's integrated into a mundane ambience. Think of Friday the 13th or Scream. Part of the fear from those movies comes from the terrible realization that the place you feel the safest is actually where you're the most vulnerable. That where you're comfortable and at ease might be hiding a terrible threat to you. This is so effective because it triggers such a paranoia on you that before you realize you can't open your fridge at night without taking a look behind your back to see that there's nothing there. Silent Hill exploits this, but that's not the only reason for the realistic depiction of the town. As we stated before, one of the core elements of the story is the town's cult and the ever-growing power of their god. What a better way to depict this to the player than by showing him how the normality is now changed by this corrupted, rusty, industrial, dark world. We can see in first hand how the power of the cult is transforming everything around us, how a new reality has been created. The best example of this comes right after Dahlia tricks the protagonist and defeats Alessa using the you know, that thing. Once Harry wakes up again, he will now find himself in an even gruesome and weirder place, a sort of amalgamation of all the other places we have visited before, that signals how the god's power is at an all-time peak. The wiki says that this place is different from the other world, called Nowhere. But some people say that this is just the other world, but better or worse. Look, this is a fandom that loves to argue, but hey, don't worry, this is definitely not our lowest fight. There were others much worse. Yet, I think we are still missing something here. Something that is also caused by this transformation of the mundane, but has a different effect on us. We're in the other world and we return to a room already visited in its normal version. We're struck by the same doubts over and over. Why has this thing changed like this? Why is this awful looking thing replacing what was here before? What's the meaning behind it? What does it symbolize? We don't know it yet, but the game is using all this as a subtle way to tell the story. For example, in the boiling room of the Midwich School, we found out that instead of machinery, what gives heat to the school in the other world is a sacrificial pyre. This is something intriguing to the player, to say the least, and it's already pointing him to the right direction. He still doesn't know what actually happened, but once he does, it won't feel like it came out of nowhere, but like a logical turn of events. It is thanks to this before and after that we can get a glance at what is hidden behind all this awful stuff. We need to see what was normal in order to let our imagination go wild and start thinking on the meaning behind all this transformation. But if they have a meaning, then there must be someone that provides them with significance, right? The fact that all these changes seems to express something already indicates us that what we are seeing are none other than manifestation of the unconscious view of those same things from somebody else's mind. And thus, the scenery turns out to be the biggest exponent of a core concept of the game, that we are, metaphorically or literally, in someone else's nightmares, Alessa's nightmares. Brilliant, huh? Yet, experimenting that much with groundbreaking things always leads to some degree of errors. Although mainly successful, the game's combination of those three artistic visions we previously mentioned didn't always lead to the best results. Flaws are inevitable, and Silent Hill has its fair share of it. A big one concerns the design of the monsters. I know many people will get angry with what I'm about to say, but here goes nothing. So, personally, I think that the designs of the majority of the enemies in this game are dull, unoriginal, and in many cases looks straight out copy from a Resident Evil game.
Why you pouring me? I'm right.
Look, I'm sorry, but things like the dogs, the flying dinosaurs, the cockroaches all seems to enter the category of mutant animals more fitting to the laps of Umbrella rather than a representation of someone's nightmare or the power of an ancient god. As a result, many of them seems out of place, like they put it here because they worked in Resident Evil, so why not here? But even the ones that are more original and coherent with the plot, like the nurses and doctors, are designed in the most lazy and simple way possible. I know that this issue comes from the technical limitations of the PS1, since it can barely renderize details in the NPCs. But if that's the case, then explain me how we got to the final boss then. They nailed the combination of dark magic elements with the unconscious construct that many have over how a demon should look like. I know that you need to save the best for the end, but the difference of quality between this and the rest is enormous. I mean, come on, the previous boss is just a giant moth. And look, I know that there are explanations, a bit forced if you ask me, about why these monsters are like this and that it makes sense with the general story. But regardless of that, I still think that it was an overall wasted resource. And it's a real shame, because I know a lot of people who told me that they didn't play this game and jumped right to the second one because all Silent Hill games look cool because of their neat monsters, except the first one. The monsters of that game look boring, and so the game must be too old to be scary. Ha 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 ha, ha 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 ha, ha ha. I need a drink. Another major critique, and a controversial too, regards the voice acting. Now, I wanna get something clear. There were almost no horror games which did any professional or good job in this aspect. There were exceptions, yeah, most prominently Metal Gear Solid, which came out a year ago, but for the most part, the performances were straight out awful. This is why so many games from the end of the 90s had such a bad voice acting that now all of them are just meme content at this point. Just take a look at some scenes for one of the most successful games of the genre.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life. But Barry, didn't you say you're going back to the dining room to do some research? Why on earth are you here?
I just had something I wanted to check. Now, let's get back to searching for the lost captain and Chris, shall we?
Thank you, Barry.
Yeah.
Ah, video games, the new art medium. But despite how terrible it is and all that, I think that it fits right in with the tone of Resident Evil. It gives charisma and charm to a game that never actually takes itself serious in the first place. It's a cheesy voice acting for a cheesy story. The bad delivery of lines becomes just another funny yet fitting layer of this B-type adventure. But, as you already know, Silent Hill takes itself way more serious than Resident Evil. Therefore, we can already guess that bad voice acting, instead of help, will decrease the quality of the story, right? Well, it's not that simple. Remember when I told you before how some music choices seem to be a nod to Twin Peaks? This, alongside other references, makes it clear that David Lynch's work was very influential in the development of the game. And interestingly enough, one of Lynch's famous artistic choices is the use of characters that, to put it mildly, just speak weird. Really weird. In many of his films, we see dialogue that is just off. What they say and how they say it and how they move, it's all wrong. Just look at this scene and you'll see what I mean.
Her name is Lil. She's my mother's sister's girl.
Federal.
Good luck, Chet. Sam, you stick with Chet. He's got his own M.O. Modus operandi.
It's like they're aliens trying to pass as humans. Yet, this isn't a mistake, but rather a deliberated choice. Lynch wants the viewer to feel uncomfortable, to see how behind all this normality there is something terrible going on. And so, many people argue that the bad voice acting in this game is also a deliberated choice. They see it as yet another element that helps create this oniric sense of weirdness. I would buy this in a game like Silent Hill 2, where the actors, although oddly enough, still show a level of professionalism and talent at playing their roles. They acted strange, sure, but still show emotion when it was needed. In Silent Hill 1, well...
Gibberish like that. Any idea what it means?
Darkness devouring the town. Must be on drugs. They sell them to the tourists. The Force still can't figure out who's behind it. None of our leads have panned out, and the investigation is stalled.
What could drug trafficking have to do with all this?
I really don't know. But maybe that's the darkness she was talking about. That's all I can think of.
Not only are they reading their lines like fucking robots, but the dialogue is just plain bad. Jumping from talking about a crazy lady to fucking drugs in a fucking second. Oh yeah, she must be on drugs, Sybil. It's not like we're in a fucking H.P. Lovecraft story. And yeah, by darkness, she sure meant drugs. It's not like there is a fucking god coming to our plane of existence. I'm sorry, but I think this is so straight out bad that this is now funny to me. What shocks me the most is the fact that the character that you would expect to speak like an alien from Mars, Dahlia Gillespie, is actually the one that acts in a way more fitting to her role as it is portrayed in media in general. Like yeah, she's a witch and so she doesn't talk like a normal person, but she still managed to convey human emotions, and I can't say the same for the rest of the normal characters. She nailed her part in a way I can't believe that a woman behaves like this in the real world. But then goes Alessa talking like a 30-year-old woman pretending to be a 5-year-old child, and I'm supposed to think that this is deliberated?
I just want you to lend me a teeny bit of your power, that's all. No, I don't want to do it. It will make everyone happy, and it's for your own good, too. Oh, but Mommy, I just want to be with you.
Sorry, but I don't. But hey, if it works for you, then great. More power to you, man. Lastly, I do want to mention some issues I have with the plot, particularly with how the two major aspects of it, the cult side and the human psyche part, were attached to each other. Now, don't get me wrong, I really like the approach in which everything was structured, how the parts related to the religious side of the game were the pillars of the story, while the psychological elements stay behind as a sort of supplement that brings nuances to the general story, primarily by putting most of the weight in Alessa's perspective. Overall, I think the story did a great job at keeping both elements in balance without any of it feeling out of place or too confusing. That being said, I still have the impression that both ideas could have been more polished. I feel like the exploration of Alessa's mind was still too short and superficial, leaving many important elements mostly underdeveloped, like the feeling of guilt that she feels for being cursed with those powers, for example. The same applies to the cult part, since yeah, we know how they operate and we can see elements of their rituals spread all over the town, which is neat, but we barely know anything about their origins, their core beliefs, how they attract and turn people into their religious organization. If you ask me, all of this is just a result of merging these two sides into one story. The time you need to fully develop one of them was needed to construct the other one, and vice versa. But I would be lying if this is just the only thing that Silent Hill should improve story-wise. I think they have used way too much the resource of teleportation and fainting used to give crucial information simply because they didn't know how to convey it in a more organic way. We also have a protagonist that doesn't have any development or depth whatsoever, besides being worried and constantly asking for his daughter.
Have you seen a little girl anywhere? Just turned 7. She's only 7, short, black hair. I'm looking for my daughter.
What, she's your daughter?
Yes.
And a final segment that leads to the final boss that's way too long. So much so that it becomes more frustrating than scary and has puzzles that are stupidly difficult. Why the fuck should I assume that a balance has 2 legs? Not to mention, of course, the occasional visual glitch that can occur once in a while. Despite all this, I can't say I don't love this game. Heck, the fact that I'm doing this video is just a small attempt, my small attempt, to keep this game relevant, to prevent it to just fade away into obscurity, to keep the discourse alive. If you haven't played this game yet, please consider giving it a chance. I can't stress this enough. I know it's old, but to think that ugly graphics means that no fear can be conveyed is a severe misunderstatement. There are many great horror games made to this day using the PS1 graphics and designs that are incredible, like Murder House or Bloodwash. Not to say that it's a great game to hop into one of the best franchises of the history of video games.
No puedo dejarte y menos olvidarte. No puedo saber qué quieres de mí. Puedo tocarte, incluso verte. Ven hacia mí. Vamos más cerca. Cerca de mí, no me persigas, no lo soporto, ¿por qué me torturas? ¿Qué quieres de mí? Dime quién eres, dime dónde estás, ¿qué quieres de mí? ¿Qué necesitas de mí? No puedo saberlo, ¿qué quieres de mí?
Dime quién eres, dime dónde estás, ¿qué quieres de mí? ¿Qué necesitas de mí? Dime quién eres, dime dónde estás.